The table was set the way I always had. Plain but steady roast chicken, green beans from the garden, a loaf of bread I'd baked that morning. For a moment, it almost felt like the dinners we used to share before Celeste married into the Donnelly family. But the silence at the table was heavy, and I knew something was waiting to break. Celeste's fork clattered against her plate, the sharp sound making me flinch. She didn't bother to lower her voice. "You have 24 hours to get your stuff out. Mom, this house belongs to Eleanor now." Her hand hit the table with a finality that felt like a gavel. I looked at her across the dishes I had prepared, searching for any trace of the little girl I once walked to school in the snow, her mittened hand holding mine. Instead, I saw the tightened jaw of a woman who had chosen another family over her own. My chest tightened, but I didn't argue. Words would only make me small in her eyes, and I refused to give her that satisfaction. I kept my gaze steady, though inside I felt the floorboards tilt beneath me. My daughter's voice carried the certainty of a verdict already decided. I lowered my hands into my lap, pressing my fingers together until they ached. Using silence as my shield, my father's clock ticked steadily on the wall, each swing of the pendulum counting down the hours I apparently had left. When the meal ended, I rose without a word, cleared my plate, and walked toward the hallway. My daughter's eyes followed me, but I did not turn back. In the quiet of my room, the weight of her words pressed down, and I reached for the phone I could not yet bring myself to use. I closed the bedroom door behind me, shutting out the echo of Celeste's voice. The walls of this room had carried me through widowhood, through nights of fear, when the roof leaked, and I patched it myself with tar bought on credit. I could still smell the faint tang of paint from the summer. I scraped the porch bare and coated it fresh, determined not to let the house crumble just because I was left alone to tend it. I sat on the edge of the bed, the quilt I'd sewn years ago folded neatly across my knees. My phone rested in my palm, its dark screen waiting. I thought of Nora, of neighbors who might listen, of cousins who would shake their heads in pity. But the thought of speaking the words, "My daughter has thrown me out," made my chest seize. I could not yet give the betrayal oxygen. Instead, I pressed the phone against my heart, as if the silence itself could shield me. My mind wandered back to the winter after my husband's death. When I walked into the bank with trembling hands and begged for time on the mortgage, they had given me none. So I took a second job at the school cafeteria, rolling silverware at dawn before starting my shift as secretary. 3 years of double work, 3 years of paying every cent. That was how this house had survived. The floor creaked above me as Celeste moved about, perhaps calling Eleanor, perhaps confirming my eviction. I lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling I had repainted twice, a soft eggshell that reflected the lamp's glow. My breathing slowed, steadied. Tomorrow I would not raise my voice or beg for her mercy. Tomorrow I would prepare. Sleep came late, but when it did, it carried me into a morning where my silence would no longer be weakness, but the start of something else entirely. Morning light crept through the curtains, and with it came memories I could not quiet. I thought back to the day my husband's heart failed him in the driveway, and how suddenly the world had shifted onto my shoulders. Celeste was only 17 then, her future still unformed, her eyes wide with fear that she would lose everything at once. I promised her she wouldn't. I worked late into nights, balancing school schedules with a second job. I kept her in the house she loved, cooked meals even when my body begged for rest, and sold my mother's gold necklace to cover her first semester at SUNY Buffalo. I told myself it was only jewelry, but when the clasp left an empty line in my palm, it felt as if a piece of my own past had been pawned away to secure hers. Celeste thrived at school. She studied accounting, wore blazers from consignment shops I paid for, and sent home photographs of herself standing proudly outside the library. Yet her visits grew shorter. Holidays became excuses. Phone calls dwindled to texts. By the time she graduated, her world seemed already claimed by another family. The Donnellys, Eleanor Donnelly, polished and commanding, had taken to introducing Celeste as if she were her daughter-in-law long before the wedding. At first, I told myself it was kindness, that Eleanor simply filled a gap I could not. But over time, I saw how Celeste leaned toward their wealth and influence, how she blushed at Eleanor's approval in ways she never did at mine. I watched quietly as Eleanor hosted dinners in her suburban home near Pittsford, where the table gleamed with silver I could never afford. Celeste laughed at their jokes, adopted their mannerisms, and came home carrying stories that did not include me. My words of caution fell flat. She insisted Eleanor only wanted the best for her. What I didn't say aloud was that Eleanor wanted something else, too, to shape Celeste's loyalty, to fold her neatly into a world where I had no place. And now, years later, that seed had grown into the ultimatum that rang in my ears. I rose from the bed, the ache of those choices heavy, and steadied myself for the sound of a knock that was bound to come. By late morning, the house was quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of traffic from Lake Avenue. I had been up since dawn, sorting the last of the boxes I had carried to a rented storage unit on Ridge Road. My sofa, the flat-screen television, even the heavy oak dresser. I'd saved months for all of it, gone before anyone else could lay claim. The walls looked barer, but the emptiness gave me a strange calm. The knock came sharp and confident. Before I could answer, the front door swung open and Eleanor Donnelly stepped inside without hesitation. She wore a tailored coat, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Her eyes moved across the room as if she were surveying property she had already purchased. "Well," she said, folding her arms, "it's smaller than I remembered. And this wallpaper, Helena, it belongs in another century." She smirked, as though her judgment alone could strip the house of its worth. I stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching her glide through the living room. She reached for the spot where the sofa had been, her hand hovering in disbelief. "Where is everything?" she asked sharply. "I took what was mine," I answered, my voice steady. Her gaze snapped to me, eyes narrowing. "You had no right. This house, this furniture, it's all Celeste's now. You can't strip it bare just because you're bitter." I didn't move. I let her words fall one by one into the silence between us. She didn't know the half of it, didn't know the receipts in my files, the statements with my name alone. The nights I had patched leaks, so her son's wife would always have a roof over her head when she visited. Eleanor turned toward the dining room, her irritation mounting as she found more empty spaces. The echo of her heels followed her into the hall, but the hollow rooms told their own story. What she thought belonged to her was never hers to begin with. I followed quietly, already certain this confrontation was only the beginning. After Eleanor left, the silence in the house felt heavier than her words. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bare patch of floor where my sofa had once stood, and the emptiness pressed against my chest. The truth was simple and terrifying. If they forced me out, I had nowhere certain to go. My savings were thin after years of patching bills and covering Celeste's start in life. The thought of renting in Rochester's rising market felt impossible. I pulled on my coat and walked toward the lake, hoping the cold air off Ontario would clear my mind. The streets were lined with maples beginning to turn, their leaves gathering in drifts that rustled under my shoes. I had walked these sidewalks for decades, pushing Celeste in her stroller, carrying groceries, rushing home from work with supper waiting to be made. Each step reminded me that my life was woven into this neighborhood, as permanent as the cracks in the pavement. But permanence felt like a lie now. I pictured myself packing everything into storage, sleeping in Nora's spare room, reduced to a guest in the city where I had built my life. For a moment, the weight of it nearly bent me. I imagined surrender, handing over the keys, letting Celeste and Eleanor have what they wanted. At least then the struggle would be over. I returned home, the house dim with late afternoon light, and climbed the narrow attic stairs almost without thinking. Dust clung to the beams and boxes sagged in the corners. One carton sat apart. The handwriting on its lid was faded, but still mine. I pulled it open and found folders, receipts, and an envelope marked in my husband's hand. The sight of it steadied me. My fear was real, but so was the paper trail that proved every sacrifice I had made. I carried the box down the stairs, my arms trembling, not from weakness, but from something beginning to rise. I set the box on the dining room table and brushed away a layer of dust. Inside were the fragments of a life I had fought to keep together. Warranties for appliances long replaced, stacks of repair receipts, yellowing bank statements. But deeper in the pile, beneath folders tied with rubber bands that had cracked from age, I traced the ink with my finger, remembering the day we signed it at the Monroe County office, proud and nervous, feeling as though we were finally standing on our own ground. Next came receipts for roofing shingles, a furnace replacement, and a plumber's invoice written in my handwriting with the note, "Paid in full." Each page was a reminder of the money I had poured into this house after he was gone. At the bottom rested an envelope addressed to me in my father-in-law's careful script. My hands shook as I slid the letter out, dated shortly before his death. It was a notarized statement affirming his wish that the house remain in my name to protect Helena and provide her security. He had understood better than anyone the fragility of life and the weight it left behind. I pressed the paper flat against the table, my breath catching. For years I'd believed I was alone in defending this place. Now even from the grave, there was proof that someone had stood with me. I picked up the phone and dialed Nora. Her voice, brisk and steady as always, was a lifeline. I told her about the letter, the deeds, the receipts. She listened without interruption, then said she would go to the Monroe County Clerk's office in the morning to pull official records. "Keep everything safe," she told me. "If what you have is valid, they can't just sweep you aside." After I hung up, I stacked the papers carefully back into the box, my hands steadier than they had been in days. The shadows in the room no longer felt suffocating. For the first time since Celeste's words had cut through me, I sensed the beginning of a path forward. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the box of papers spread before me, the clock ticking too loud on the wall. When the phone finally rang, I nearly dropped it. Nora's voice came through clear but measured. "I checked the clerk's office," she said. "The deed is still in your name, Helena. It was never transferred legally. This property belongs to you and no one else." I pressed my hand against the table to steady myself. Relief flooded in first, but it was quickly chased by a surge of anger so sharp it made my throat burn. All the talk of eviction and Eleanor's supposed ownership had been nothing but air. Celeste's ultimatum, Eleanor's smug entrance. They were built on lies. "They had to know," I whispered. "Celeste must have known, or she let herself believe what was convenient." Nora replied gently, "But the law is clear. You hold the title. If they try to force you out, you have every right to fight back." I closed my eyes, the weight of years pressing down. My daughter had been manipulated. Yes, but she had also chosen to stand against me. Eleanor's influence explained part of it, but Celeste's silence explained the rest. She had not defended me because she no longer saw this house as mine. The phone felt heavy in my hand as Nora outlined the next steps, filing an affidavit, securing certified copies of the deed, documenting every repair and payment I had made. My notes and receipts would not only show ownership, but prove that I had been the one keeping the house alive. When I hung up, I stood and gathered the papers into neat stacks, sliding them into folders with a precision that steadied me. Half relief, half fury, that was what lived in me now. Relief that the foundation was mine. Fury that my own daughter had tried to rip it away. I slipped the folders into my bag and set them by the door. The house was quiet, but I could already hear the echo of a confrontation that was coming. By late afternoon, the driveway filled with the sound of a car door slamming. I stood in the hallway, folder of papers under my arm, and watched through the lace curtain as Celeste and Eleanor stepped out with boxes stacked high. Celeste's face was tight with determination. Eleanor carried herself with the air of someone arriving to collect what she already owned. They didn't knock this time. They walked straight to the porch, but their steps faltered when they saw the notice taped to the front door. A stamped document from the Monroe County Clerk's office, prepared with Nora's guidance, declaring a pending legal action to reaffirm my ownership. Eleanor leaned forward, reading aloud, her voice sharp but unsteady. "Filed by Helena Marwick, sole title holder." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She spun toward Celeste. "This is nonsense. She's bluffing." But Celeste's hands trembled around the box she carried. She scanned the page again and again, her skin paling. For the first time, her confidence cracked. Neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk. Mr. Rhodes from next door, Mrs. Whitaker across the street, drawn by the raised voices. Their eyes darted from Eleanor's sputtering indignation to my steady stance at the doorway. "You embarrassed yourself," Eleanor snapped at me, her voice carrying farther than she meant. "Dragging papers into this, parading it in public." I stepped forward and peeled the notice from the door, holding it against my chest. I didn't parade anything, I said calmly. I protected what was mine. Celeste's gaze dropped, the box slipping slightly in her arms. She looked not at me, but at the neighbors watching, their faces a mirror of judgment she could not escape. Eleanor hissed something under her breath and grabbed Celeste's arm, pulling her back toward the car. The boxes were shoved inside in silence. I stood on the porch, the notice still warm in my hand, while the car reversed hastily out of the driveway. The neighbors lingered, their nods quiet but clear, and the house behind me seemed to breathe for the first time in years. It was just after dusk when I heard the knock, softer than Eleanor's had ever been. I opened the door to find Celeste alone, her shoulders hunched, her eyes darting past me as if afraid someone might see her there. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, setting her purse down with a tremor in her hands. "Mom," she began, her voice hushed. "I didn't know it would go this far." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. She looked younger in that moment, but also more fragile, as if the weight of Eleanor's promises had hollowed her out. "She told me," Celeste hesitated, then pressed on. "She told me if you gave up the house, she'd make sure we were taken care of, that I'd have support, connections, money when I needed it. She said you didn't need this place anymore, that it was selfish to hold on." Her words landed heavy, but I kept my arms folded, steadying myself against the pull of memory of all the nights I worked to keep this roof above her head, of the sacrifices she had forgotten or chosen not to see. "So you chose her over me," I said softly. Celeste's eyes filled, but she didn't deny it. "I thought it was the only way forward. I thought you'd understand." I shook my head slowly. "Understanding is not the same as surrender, and I won't surrender what I've bled to protect." For a long moment she stood there, torn between shame and stubbornness. Then she lifted her purse again, her mouth tight, and walked to the door. She didn't look back. The silence she left behind was colder than any argument, but it braced me for what had to come next. Weeks later, the house no longer felt like a refuge, but a battlefield scarred by words I couldn't erase. I walked each room one last time, touching the walls I had painted, the floors I had refinished, and I knew the house had already given me all it could. It was mine, yes, but it was also heavy with memories that pressed down like weights I no longer wanted to carry. With Nora's guidance, I listed it on the market, not out of defeat but out of choice. The buyers were a young couple starting their first chapter, their excitement a mirror of the hope I once felt. When I signed the papers at the title office, my hand was steady. This time I was the one deciding what stayed and what ended. I used the sale to purchase a modest condo in Iron Diet, just a short drive from Lake Ontario. The windows opened to water and sky, and for the first time in years, I breathed without bracing for the next blow. I arranged my furniture carefully, each piece a reminder of what I had fought to keep, not what had been nearly stolen. On the mantel, I placed a single brass key from the old house. I tied a ribbon around it and labeled it with one word: boundaries. It was not a token of loss, but a marker of the line I had finally drawn. Eleanor's influence waned quickly after the public humiliation, and Celeste was left to live with the distance she had chosen. I could not mend what she had broken, but I could protect myself from it. As I closed the door to my new home, the key warm in my palm, I felt the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen peace on her own terms.